You've been playing us this entire time. The accusation hung in the air of the employee break room, now deadly silent despite being packed with workers. Marcus Reynolds, CEO of Pinnacle Technologies, felt his carefully constructed facade crumbling as Ellie Chen, a mid-level software developer, slapped a folder of printed emails onto the table between them. The documents were unmistakable, internal memos about the planned layoffs, marked with his digital signature, dated 3 weeks before he'd begun his undercover stint as Mark, the new IT support hire. A sea of betrayed faces surrounded him. These were the same people who'd welcomed him, trained him, shared lunches with him, people whose jobs he'd been secretly evaluating for elimination while pretending to be their colleague. "I thought you were different," Ellie continued, her voice trembling with quiet rage. "You sat right here yesterday and promised we were all safe. You looked me in the eye while knowing my entire department is on the chopping block." Marcus opened his mouth, but no words came. The conference room door slammed open, and the production crew that had been documenting his undercover journey for the corporate video series rushed in. The cameras that had been Marcus's idea, his brilliant PR move to humanize the company during the restructuring, were now capturing his complete undoing. "Turn those damn cameras off," he finally managed, his voice hoarse. "No," said another voice, James from accounting, standing now. "Let them record. Let everyone see exactly who's running this company." The crowd parted as someone new approached. A woman Marcus didn't recognize walked deliberately toward him, extended her hand, and said the words that would change everything. "Hello, Mr. Reynolds. My name is Alexandra Vega. I'm the real owner of Pinnacle Technologies, and I believe it's time we had a chat about your performance review." 3 weeks earlier, Marcus Reynolds stood before his bathroom mirror, barely recognizing himself. The stubble that had grown over the weekend itched against his palm as he rubbed his jaw. His $300 haircut had been replaced by a mediocre trim from a strip mall barber, designer suits exchanged for off-the-rack khakis, and a button-down that hung awkwardly on his frame. Perfect, utterly forgettable, just another tech worker. "Remind me again why I'm doing this," he called out to Diane, his executive assistant, who waited in the living room of his penthouse. "Because the board thinks you're out of touch," she replied, not looking up from her tablet. "Because employee morale is at an all-time low, because you need positive press before announcing the restructuring. Take your pick." Marcus scowled at his reflection. 6 years as CEO of Pinnacle Technologies, and now he had to prove himself by playing dress-up. The company had grown from a promising startup to a tech industry powerhouse under his leadership. Their facial recognition security systems were in government buildings across 3 continents. Their consumer apps were on millions of phones. He had made difficult decisions, yes, but they were always for the good of the company. And now he was being forced to go undercover among his own employees to reconnect with the company culture before he could move forward with the necessary cuts. "The micromanagement of the board is getting old," he muttered, adjusting his fake glasses. "I built this company." "You acquired this company," Diane corrected, finally looking up. "And the board is concerned about a mass exodus of talent. The 3 founders you pushed out last year were beloved. The employees don't trust leadership anymore." "That's business, they'll get over it." "Maybe, but right now they're organizing. There's talk of unionizing." That got his attention. Marcus turned from the mirror. "Impossible, we've been careful." "Not careful enough." HR reports increased activity around collective action discussions. "The board wants you to see for yourself what's happening on the ground before you cut 30% of the workforce." Marcus sighed. It was a waste of time, but he'd jump through the hoops. It would make for good PR, at least. The cameras would capture him connecting with workers, making tough but compassionate decisions. The restructuring would still happen, but with a human face attached to it, his face. "1 week," he said firmly. "I'm not playing this game any longer than that." Diane smiled thinly. 3 weeks minimum. The production team needs enough footage. And remember your cover story, you're Mark Wilson, new IT support, recently relocated from our Austin office. "I know my own cover story," he snapped. "And remember, absolutely no one at the company knows about this except me, HR Director Phillips, and the documentary crew, who are posing as a team doing a general feature on tech workplaces." Marcus nodded absently, his mind already working on how to use this opportunity to identify the troublemakers, the ones stirring up discontent, pushing unionization talk. By the time this charade was over, he'd know exactly who needed to be on the first round of cuts. The Pinnacle Technologies headquarters sprawled across 5 floors of a gleaming downtown tower. As Mark Wilson, Marcus entered through the main employee entrance for the first time ever, bypassing his private elevator. The sensation was strange, like visiting a parallel universe where he was nobody. Security took his ID badge photo and he was assigned to the 3rd floor where IT support shared space with several development teams. His supervisor would be Raj Patel, the head of IT operations, a man Marcus had never actually met, despite approving his promotion last year. "New guy, huh?" said the receptionist, handing him a temporary badge. "Good luck." The way she said it made Marcus pause. "Is there something I should know?" She looked up, surprised by the question. "Oh, it's been tough around here lately. Management decisions, you know how it is." "No, tell me." The receptionist, Zoe, according to her nameplate, hesitated. "Let's just say everything changed after the founders left. The new CEO," she lowered her voice, "he's never even been to this floor, makes all these decisions from his ivory tower without knowing how they affect us. But you didn't hear that from me." Marcus forced a smile. "Of course not." His first revelation barely through the door, so this was what they said when they thought he couldn't hear. The 3rd floor was a maze of cubicles and glass-walled meeting rooms. People hunched over keyboards, conversation a low buzz beneath the hum of electronics. No one looked up as he passed. These were his employees, yet they felt like strangers. "Mark," a cheerful voice called out. A man in his 40s with a neatly trimmed beard approached, hand extended. "Raj Patel, welcome to IT hell," he laughed, kidding mostly. Marcus shook his hand, nodding the firm grip. "Thanks for having me." "Austin office getting too weird for you?" Raj asked as he led Marcus to a small cubicle. "Something like that," Marcus replied, remembering his cover story. "Needed a change of scenery." "Well, you came at an interesting time. Rumor has it another round of layoffs is coming. But hey, it usually survives those. People always need their password resets, right?" His laugh didn't reach his eyes. Marcus's cubicle was tiny, with just enough room for a desk, computer, and chair. He'd forgotten spaces this small existed in his building. His own office was larger than some apartments. "The team meeting starts in 10, Raj said. "You can get settled and meet everyone then." Once alone, Marcus took stock of his surroundings. The computer was at least 2 generations behind what executives used. The chair creaked ominously when he sat. How did people work in these conditions? The team meeting revealed a group of 7 IT support specialists, now 8 with him, responsible for over 500 employees. They ran through current tickets, system updates, and ongoing issues with a cloud migration project that Marcus himself had approved 6 months ago. He was surprised to hear it was still causing problems. "The migration keeps failing because we're trying to do it with reduced server capacity," explained Ellie Chen, who Marcus learned was actually a developer forced to help with it after her team was downsized. "We need to either roll back or invest in more infrastructure." "Management wants it done with what we have," Raj replied wearily, "so we'll keep trying." "By management, you mean Reynolds," said a young man named James from the accounting department, who apparently attended these meetings because he handled IT procurement budgets. "The same guy who rejected our last 3 budget requests." Marcus felt heat rise to his face but kept quiet. "Let's not start that again," Raj sighed. "Welcome to the team, Mark. You'll be shadowing Ellie this week for the basics." Ellie Chen looked up from her laptop, offering a brief smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Hope you're a fast learner. We're always understaffed." By noon, Marcus's head was spinning. He shadowed Ellie through 6 support tickets, each revealing operational problems he had no idea existed. Software licenses expired because renewal notices went to departments that no longer existed after his last reorganization. Equipment failed because maintenance had been deferred too long. Employees struggled with the new security protocols his team had implemented without adequate training resources. "Is it always this chaotic?" he asked as they headed to the break room for lunch. "This is actually a good day," Ellie replied, pushing open the door to reveal a small room with mismatched furniture and a refrigerator that wheezed asthmatically. No system-wide outages yet. The break room filled quickly. Marcus recognized faces from company materials but had never spoken to any of them. They greeted Ellie warmly while eyeing him with curiosity. "New IT guy," she explained, "Mark from Austin." A chorus of sympathetic groans greeted this information. Transferred right before the axe falls. Bad timing, man, said a woman with purple hair who introduced herself as Sasha from graphic design. What axe? Marcus asked, playing dumb. The room exchanged knowing looks. Reynolds and his vampire squad are planning another right-sizing, James from accounting said, making air quotes. Word is they're targeting at least 30% this time. Vampire squad, Marcus echoed, his sandwich halfway to his mouth. Executive team, Ellie explained. They suck the life out of everything and never come out in daylight, at least not down here. Laughter rippled through the room, but it had a bitter edge. You guys don't think very highly of leadership, huh? Marcus ventured. The room fell silent, then Sasha leaned forward. Let me tell you about our fearless leader, she said. Marcus Reynolds took over Pinnacle 3 years ago. It was founded by 3 brilliant developers who actually cared about making good products and treating people well. Reynolds forced them out, pumped up the stock price with short-term cost-cutting, and is now dismantling everything that made this place special. All so he can get his performance bonus before moving on to destroy another company. The passion in her voice took Marcus aback. Was that really how they saw him, as a corporate raider rather than a leader making necessary changes? That seems harsh, he managed. Maybe the business needed to evolve. Evolve, sure, said Raj, who had joined them quietly. But there's a difference between evolution and extinction. Reynolds doesn't understand what we actually do here. He's never bothered to find out. Word is he won't even use an elevator if there are regular employees on it, added James. God forbid he might have to speak to the peasants. That stung because it was true. Marcus had indeed waited for empty elevators rather than sharing with employees. He told himself it was about efficiency, not wanting to be delayed by small talk. Now it sounded far worse through their eyes. I heard they're bringing in cameras, said a woman he hadn't met. Some kind of documentary about innovative workplaces or something. PR bull to make the company look good before the layoffs. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. They weren't supposed to know about the documentary crew's real purpose. When did you hear that? He asked. Email went out this morning. They start filming tomorrow. We're supposed to act natural and pretend everything's fantastic. She rolled her eyes. The conversation moved on to weekend plans and a birthday celebration for someone in marketing. Marcus sat quietly, processing what he'd heard. These people saw him as a villain, a callous, greedy executive destroying their workplace. None of them knew that every decision he'd made had been to save the company from the financial mismanagement of the founders, who had prioritized employee perks over profitability. But he couldn't explain that, not as Mark from It. The afternoon brought more revelations. Problems that had been labeled, resolved in the reports that reached his desk were actually just bandaged with temporary fixes. Teams worked in silos because his restructuring had broken natural collaborations. The new performance metrics he'd implemented were being gamed rather than driving real improvement. Why hasn't anyone reported these issues upward? He asked Ellie as they tried to restore a corrupted database that marketing needed for a campaign launch the next day. She gave him a look of disbelief. Are you serious? We've tried. Every communication gets filtered through layers of management. By the time anything reaches the executive floor, it's been sanitized into everything's fine or minor issues being addressed. Anyone who pushes harder gets labeled as not a team player and finds themselves on the next cut list. Marcus frowned. That contradicted everything his executive team had told him about their open-door policy and transparent communication channels. There must be channels to raise concerns, he insisted. Sure, there's an anonymous suggestion box on the internet, Ellie said, typing rapidly. Legend has it that it feeds directly into Reynolds' trash folder. Another laugh at his expense. Marcus was starting to feel distinctly uncomfortable. Was his entire management structure complicit in hiding problems from him, or were these employees exaggerating? The database finally came back online just as a group of unfamiliar faces appeared at the entrance to their work area. The documentary crew had arrived a day early, 3 people with casual clothes and professional equipment. We're just getting some establishing shots today, explained a woman who introduced herself as the director. Don't mind us, pretend we're not here. Impossible, of course. Everyone immediately became self-conscious, straightening posture and lowering voices. Marcus felt a strange doubling of his deception. Now he was pretending to be an employee, pretending to work normally for cameras that were pretending to make a different documentary than they actually were. The layers of falsehood made his head hurt. By the end of his first day, Marcus was exhausted in a way his regular job never left him. The physical discomfort of the small chair, the constant interruptions, the emotional labor of maintaining his cover, it all added up to a bone-deep weariness. "Good first day?" Raj asked as people started packing up to leave. "Illuminating," Marcus replied honestly. "Team usually grabs drinks at Cooper's down the street on Thursdays," Raj said. "You should join tomorrow, best way to really get to know everyone." Marcus hadn't anticipated socializing beyond work hours. The thought made him uncomfortable, but he nodded. "Sounds great." As he gathered his things, he noticed Ellie in intense conversation with James and Sasha in the corner of the office. They fell silent when they noticed him looking, offering tight smiles before turning away. Something about their body language triggered his instincts. They were hiding something. Marcus left the building through the main exit, nodding to the security guard, another first. His driver was waiting 2 blocks away, as arranged. "How was your first day playing peasant, sir?" David asked as Marcus collapsed into the backseat of the luxury sedan. "Enlightening," Marcus replied, loosening his fake glasses, "and disturbing. I've got a lot to think about." That night in his penthouse, Marcus reviewed what he'd learned. His employees hated him. They saw him as a villain. His management team was filtering information, presenting a rosier picture than reality, and somewhere in the building, employees were organizing against him. He opened his laptop and pulled up the personnel files for Ellie Chen, James Harrington, and Sasha Mendes. All solid performers according to their reviews. No red flags, but his instincts told him they were at the center of whatever was brewing. The documentary crew would be his eyes and ears. He'd make sure they captured whatever these 3 were planning. The next morning, Marcus arrived early. The 3rd floor was nearly empty except for the cleaning staff and a few early birds. He found Raj already at his desk, looking haggard. "Server crash at 3 a.m., Raj explained when Marcus asked if he was okay. "Had to come in and restore from backups." Remotely, Marcus asked. Raj laughed hollowly. "We don't have that capability anymore. Budget cuts last quarter eliminated our remote management tools. Had to drive in." Another revelation. Marcus made a mental note to look into that decision. It seemed penny-wise and pound-foolish. The documentary crew arrived as the office filled, setting up in a conference room and then moving through the space, filming B-roll and conducting brief interviews. Marcus kept his head down, avoiding the cameras while watching how others reacted. Most employees gave rehearsed-sounding answers about company culture, but when the crew approached Ellie, she spoke with surprising candor. "Pinnacle used to be special," she told the interviewer, unaware that Marcus was within earshot. "We were building something that mattered. Now it's just about stock price and executive bonuses. Maybe your documentary can show what happens when companies forget why they exist in the first place." The interviewer glanced nervously at her producer. This wasn't the positive PR piece they'd been hired to create, but they kept the cameras rolling. Throughout the day, Marcus watched his cover identity solidify. People began treating him like a colleague rather than a newcomer. He was assigned his own support tickets. He struggled with systems he'd approved purchases for but never actually used. When he made mistakes, Ellie patiently corrected him without condescension. "You're catching on quick," she said after he successfully resolved a particularly tricky networking issue. "Most people take weeks to figure that out." "Had similar systems in Austin," he lied, feeling a strange guilt at accepting praise he hadn't earned. At lunch, the break room conversation turned to the upcoming Pinnacle Families Day, a company picnic scheduled for the following weekend. "You should come," Ellie told him. "Good way to meet people from other departments." "Reynolds will make his annual 5-minute appearance," James added. "Helicopter in, shake a few hands for the photographers, then vanish before any real conversations happen." Marcus winced internally. He had indeed planned exactly that, citing other commitments that would limit his time at the event. "I've never actually seen the CEO," he said, testing the waters. "What's he like in person?" The break room erupted in laughter. "Nobody sees Reynolds in person," Sasha explained. "He's like a corporate cryptid. Some people claim sightings, but there's never any proof." "He came to our floor once," said someone from marketing. Security cleared everyone out first. He walked through with his executive team, pointing at things and making notes. 3 departments were restructured the following week. Marcus remembered that walkthrough. It had been to assess space utilization. He hadn't realized employees had been cleared out. That had been his team's decision, not his. I heard he has a private elevator so he never has to see actual workers, added another voice. That's true, confirmed a facilities manager. I helped install the security system for it. One by one, employees shared Reynolds' sightings and rumors, each painting him as more detached and elitist than the last. Some were exaggerated, some completely false, but enough contained kernels of truth to make Marcus deeply uncomfortable. These people worked for him. They created the products that had made him wealthy, yet they saw him as a distant, uncaring figure who valued profits over people. Was that the leader he had become? The afterwork gathering at Cooper's bar revealed yet another side of Pinnacle's culture. Away from office constraints, with a drink or two in hand, his employees spoke even more freely. Marcus nursed a beer, listening more than talking. To surviving another week at Pinnacle Penitentiary, James toasted, raising his glass. The group laughed and clinked glasses. So Mark, Sasha turned to him, what made you transfer from Austin? That office hasn't been hit as hard by cuts. Marcus had prepared for this. Family reasons, my mother's health isn't great. Sympathetic nods around the table. Marcus felt another stab of guilt at exploiting their empathy with a lie. Well, we're glad to have you, Ellie said. We need good people. Even if you might not be here long, added James, none of us might be. The mood darkened. Marcus seized the opportunity to probe further. Is it really that bad? Surely the company needs skilled workers to function. Raj laughed bitterly. Tell that to Reynolds. Last quarter he outsourced an entire development team to contractors who didn't understand our architecture. The resulting bugs cost us the State Department contract. Marcus nearly choked on his beer. The loss of that contract had been attributed to aggressive competition from a rival firm, not internal issues. Management covered it up, Ellie explained, seeing his surprise. Called it a strategic pivot away from government contracts, but we lost millions because of it. The conversation turned to other disasters, projects abandoned midway, talented employees who'd left for competitors, decisions made at the executive level that made no sense to the people implementing them. With each story, Marcus's unease grew. Either his employees were delusional, or his executive team had been systematically misleading him for years. As the evening wore on, the group's camaraderie became more evident. They genuinely cared about each other and the company despite their cynicism. When someone mentioned financial struggles after a partner's job loss, others immediately offered help. When a junior developer admitted anxiety about his performance review, senior staff gave concrete advice and encouragement. These weren't disgruntled employees looking to undermine the company. They were a community trying to preserve what they valued about their workplace despite management decisions they saw as destructive. Around 10, after several rounds, Ellie's phone buzzed. She checked it, then made eye contact with James and Sasha. Some unspoken communication passed between them. We should call it a night, she announced. Early meeting tomorrow. The group dispersed, but Marcus noticed the 3 of them lingering, heads together in conversation. He pretended to be occupied with paying his tab, straining to hear their whispered exchange. Not sure we can trust, Sasha was saying. No choice now, from James. The meeting is still on, Ellie confirmed. They noticed him watching and quickly separated. Ellie approached him with a smile that seemed forced. Thanks for coming out tonight, she said. See you tomorrow. Marcus nodded, mind racing. What meeting were they planning? Was this the unionization effort Diane had mentioned? He needed to find out. The next day brought new challenges. The documentary crew was filming more extensively, conducting longer interviews and capturing team meetings. Marcus found himself constantly dodging cameras, using his hand to shield his face when they swung in his direction. The director was visibly frustrated by his camera shyness, but couldn't push too hard without revealing the true nature of their project. During a support call to the finance department, Marcus found himself face-to-face with his own executive assistant, Diane. His heart nearly stopped as she squinted at him. Have we met before? She asked, head tilted. You look familiar. I just have one of those faces, he replied quickly, adjusting his glasses. what seems to be the problem with your system? She described a minor issue with her email client, which he fixed with a few clicks, all while avoiding direct eye contact. When he finished, she was still studying him curiously. You sure we haven't met, perhaps at the Austin office? Positive, he said firmly. I'd remember meeting the CEO's assistant. That seemed to satisfy her, and she turned back to her work. Marcus retreated, pulse pounding. That had been too close. Back at the IT area, he found Ellie engaged in an intense conversation with a woman he didn't recognize, tall, with short dark hair and an air of quiet authority. They fell silent when they saw him. Mark, Ellie said with forced casualness, this is Alex from HR. She's helping us with the staffing assessments. Alex extended her hand. Nice to meet you, you're new, right? Something about her gaze made Marcus uncomfortable. It was too penetrating, too assessing. He had the unsettling feeling she was looking right through his disguise. Just transferred from Austin, he replied, shaking her hand firmly. Interesting timing, she said, nothing more, but the comment lingered uncomfortably. After she left, Marcus asked Ellie, staffing assessments, that sounds ominous. Ellie sighed, just the usual pre-layoff data gathering. They're evaluating workloads, trying to figure out how few people they can keep while maintaining minimum functionality. That woman didn't seem like typical HR. Alex, she's not, she's a consultant. Management brings her in when they're planning major changes. Marcus frowned. He hadn't authorized any consultants for HR. Was Phillips, his HR director, acting independently? The rest of the day passed in a blur of support tickets and system troubleshooting. The documentary crew filmed a team meeting where Raj announced yet another delay in the infrastructure upgrades Marcus had been told were already completed. We'll make do, Raj concluded with resignation, as always. After work, Marcus lingered, pretending to finish a ticket while actually watching Ellie, James, and Sasha. Sure enough, once most people had left, they convened in a small conference room. Through the glass walls, he could see them joined by others, including Alex from HR and several faces he recognized from different departments. A meeting across departmental lines after hours, unscheduled, exactly the kind of organization the board feared. Making a split-second decision, Marcus approached the conference room and pushed open the door. The conversation stopped immediately. A dozen faces turned to him with expressions ranging from surprise to suspicion. Sorry to interrupt, he said, but I've been noticing things this week, problems that need fixing. I want to help. Silence stretched uncomfortably, then Ellie spoke. Close the door. He did. The room remained tense. Why should we trust you? James asked bluntly. You've been here 3 days. Because I care about doing things right, Marcus replied, surprising himself with his sincerity. And from what I've seen, management doesn't see what's really happening here. Alex studied him with that uncomfortably penetrating gaze. What do you think is happening here, Mark? The question felt like a trap, but he was committed now. I think you're organizing, maybe forming a union, maybe something else, but you're trying to protect what matters about this company before Reynolds and his team destroy it completely. More silence, then unexpectedly Alex smiled. You're observant, she said, but not entirely correct. We're not forming a union. Then what is this? Ellie and James exchanged glances, then Ellie nodded. We're documenting everything, she explained. Every flawed decision, every covered-up mistake, every instance of executive mismanagement. We're building a case. For what? For the board, Alex said simply, to remove Marcus Reynolds from his position. The room tilted slightly under Marcus's feet. They weren't organizing a union, they were organizing a coup against him. You think the board will listen to employees? He asked, struggling to keep his voice neutral. They'll listen to me, Alex replied. I don't just consult for HR, I consult for the board directly, and I've been watching Reynolds destroy a perfectly good company for too long. Marcus felt like he'd walked into an alternate reality. Who was this woman? Why hadn't he been informed of a board consultant evaluating his performance? What about the documentary crew? He asked. Aren't they here to make the company look good for Reynolds? Laughter rippled through the room. That's what Reynolds thinks, Sasha said, but they're actually here for us, to capture the real story of what's happening at Pinnacle. Marcus's mind raced. The documentary had been his idea, approved by the board. Had they co-opted it without his knowledge? We need concrete evidence of the damage his policies have caused, Ellie continued. Numbers, testimonials, documentation, that's what we're collecting. And I'm helping them analyze it, James added. Financial impact, productivity losses, talent exodus, it's all being quantified. We need someone in it with access to the systems, Ellie said, finally getting to the point. Someone who can help us retrieve the emails and memos that prove Reynolds knew the consequences of his decisions and proceeded anyway. They wanted him to help them gather evidence against himself. The irony was almost too much. That sounds like hacking, he said carefully. It's whistleblowing, Alex corrected, revealing corporate malfeasance that affects shareholders, employees, and customers. There are legal protections. Marcus needed time to think. This was far bigger than a unionization effort. I need to consider this, he said. What you're asking could cost me my job. It could cost all of us our jobs, Ellie replied, but sometimes you have to risk something to save what matters. The meeting disbanded shortly after. Marcus walked out into the evening air, mind spinning. His employees weren't just dissatisfied, they were actively working to remove him with apparent support from the board itself. Everything he thought he knew about his company, his leadership, his success was being called into question. And the most disturbing part, after just 3 days seeing Pinnacle through their eyes, he was starting to think they might be right. Marcus barely slept that night. He paced his penthouse, replaying every conversation, every revelation from the past 3 days. His mind churned with conflicting emotions, anger at being targeted, confusion over this mysterious Alex person, and most surprisingly, doubt about his own leadership. Had he really destroyed what made Pinnacle special? Were his executive team's reports as sanitized as Ellie claimed? If so, how many other critical problems remained hidden from him? At 3 a.m., he made a decision. He wouldn't expose himself yet. He'd continue the charade, gather more information, and find out exactly what this group was planning. Knowledge was power, and right now, they had too much of both. By morning, he had a strategy. He'd play along, pretend to join their cause, and get access to their evidence. Then he'd know exactly what he was facing and who his real enemies were. He arrived early again, finding the office mostly empty except for Raj, who was troubleshooting a network issue that had emerged overnight. Want to learn something useful? Raj offered, gesturing to the terminal on his screen. For the next hour, Raj walked him through the complex architecture of Pinnacle's networks, systems Marcus had approved budgets for but never truly understood. Raj's explanations revealed the intelligent design behind the original infrastructure and the compromises forced by recent cost-cutting measures. See this bottleneck? Raj pointed to a diagram. This is where we sacrificed redundancy to meet the budget targets. Next time the system crashes, and it we'll lose at least a day of productivity across the company. Why wasn't this raised to leadership? Marcus asked. Raj gave him a weary look. I personally wrote a 12-page analysis with 3 different solutions, got back a form email thanking me for my feedback and saying the decision had been carefully considered. That's Reynolds speak for ignored completely. Can I see that report? Why? Raj asked, suddenly suspicious. For the project Ellie mentioned, Marcus improvised, documenting the technical impacts of management decisions. Raj studied him for a long moment, then nodded. I'll forward it to you, but be careful who sees it. Making waves around here can be career-limiting. The irony of being warned about his own retribution wasn't lost on Marcus. When Ellie arrived, she pulled Marcus aside immediately. Have you thought about what we discussed? I want to help, he said, but I need to understand what exactly you're looking for. Relief flickered across her face. We need evidence that Reynolds knew about the problems his decisions were causing and proceeded anyway. Emails, memos, anything showing he prioritized short-term stock performance over the company's actual health. And if you get this evidence, what then? Alex presents it to the board, they vote to remove Reynolds, then the real work begins, rebuilding what he's broken. The plan was breathtakingly simple and terrifyingly feasible. If they had the right evidence, the board might actually act. Several members had already expressed concerns about his methods, even while celebrating the stock performance. I'll need access to the executive email servers, he said, testing her. Already arranged, Ellie replied without hesitation. James has a friend in senior IT security who's sympathetic to our cause. He's granted us temporary admin credentials. We just need someone who knows what to look for. Marcus's stomach dropped. They had access to his emails. Had they already seen something incriminating? When do we start? He asked. Tonight after everyone leaves. The documentary crew arrived as they were speaking, setting up for another day of filming. Marcus noticed they seemed particularly interested in Ellie, following her movements more than others. Were they truly working with the employees against him, or was that just another lie? As the day progressed, Marcus found himself in a surreal double game, pretending to be an IT worker who was pretending to help a coup against himself. The layers of deception were becoming difficult to manage. During lunch, he deliberately sat with a group he hadn't interacted with much, the product design team, to gather more intelligence. "How's the new interface coming along?" he asked casually, remembering this had been a major initiative his team reported as nearly complete. The designers exchanged glances. "You mean the one that got scrapped last month?" asked a woman named Tara, "after we'd spent 6 months on it." Marcus nearly choked on his sandwich. "Scrapped? Why?" "Reynolds decided to license a third-party solution instead," explained another designer. "Said it would save money, never mind that we'd already done most of the work or that the licensed product doesn't integrate properly with our systems. Or that we had to sign a 3-year contract," added a third voice, "for software that's already outdated." Another project his executive team had reported differently. According to his CTO, the team had fallen behind schedule, and the third-party solution was more advanced than anything they could develop in-house. "The worst part," Tara continued, warming to her subject, "is that we weren't even allowed to finish it on a smaller scale to show what it could have been. Just stop everything with a day's notice and then train on the new system." The familiar pattern was emerging again, decisions made at the top, filtered through managers who massaged the information in both directions, resulting in disconnects between intention and impact. But was it incompetence or deliberate deception? By mid-afternoon, the documentary crew had set up in the largest conference room for individual interviews. Marcus watched as employee after employee was called in, emerging 30 minutes later with expressions ranging from relief to concern. "What are they asking about?" he inquired when James returned from his session. "Everything," James replied, looking shaken. "Working conditions, management decisions, the company culture before and after Reynolds took over. They're really digging deep." Ellie was called next. Through the glass walls, Marcus could see her speaking animatedly, gesturing with passion. The director leaned forward, clearly captivated by whatever she was saying. After 40 minutes, longer than anyone else, she emerged, looking both drained and determined. "Your turn," she told Marcus. His heart raced. He couldn't be on camera. If this footage was really meant for the board, his cover would be blown instantly. "I can't," he said. "I have a medical condition, facial recognition anxiety. Being filmed triggers panic attacks." Ellie looked surprised but nodded. "I'll explain to them. They've been really accommodating about different needs." She disappeared back into the conference room. Marcus watched as she spoke to the director, who frowned but ultimately nodded. Crisis averted for now. At 6 o'clock, the office had mostly cleared out. The documentary crew packed up their equipment, promising to return the next day. Only a few employees remained, including the core group from the previous night's meeting. Marcus noticed Alex arriving just as the crew left, timing that seemed deliberate. They gathered again in the same conference room. This time, Alex took charge immediately. "Mark has agreed to help access the executive communications," she announced. "Ellie will work with him to identify the relevant materials. The rest of you continue gathering documentation from your departments. We meet again Sunday night to compile everything before Monday's board meeting." Monday's board meeting? Marcus hadn't been informed of any board meeting. Was this another deception, or had the board scheduled it without his knowledge? "What exactly are we looking for?" he asked. "The smoking gun," Alex replied. "Evidence that Reynolds knew his decisions were damaging the company but proceeded anyway for personal gain. His last compensation package included a bonus tied to stock performance that vests next quarter. We believe he's gutting the company to hit those targets before cashing out. The accusation hit uncomfortably close to home. His compensation did include such provisions, standard for executives, but he wasn't planning to leave, was he? As the meeting broke up, Ellie led Marcus to a secluded corner of the IT department where 2 computers had been set up. Admin credentials are already loaded, she explained. We can access the executive server from here. The security logs have been temporarily disabled, so there won't be any record of our search. This level of preparation was alarming. Not only did they have access to restricted systems, but they'd also covered their tracks. Who was helping them? How deep did this conspiracy go? Let's start with the cloud migration project, Marcus suggested, thinking of the issues Raj had highlighted. Search for communications about the server capacity problems. Ellie nodded, fingers flying across the keyboard. Within minutes, they had access to his email account, searching through thousands of communications. Marcus watched, stomach churning, as his private discussions with his executive team were laid bare. And what he saw disturbed him deeply. There was his CIO explaining in detail the risks of proceeding with reduced capacity, the same risks Raj had identified, with a clear recommendation to delay the migration until proper infrastructure was in place. There was his own response: proceed as planned, Q3 targets must be met. There was a subsequent email chain where the CIO informed the team about system failures but instructed them to report it externally as planned maintenance rather than an outage. And most damning of all, an email where Marcus himself had written, "I don't need the technical details, just make it happen and keep it quiet. The stock can't take negative press right now." Seeing his own words through Ellie's eyes was a shock. At the time, he'd thought he was being decisive, cutting through technical complications to focus on business objectives. Now he saw how it looked from the outside: callous, reckless, concerned only with appearances and stock price. "This is exactly what we're looking for," Ellie said, forwarding the email chain to an encrypted account. "Let's check the product design cancellation next." One by one, they uncovered evidence of decisions made despite clear warnings from the teams implementing them. Budget cuts pushed through over documented objections, quality concerns dismissed as perfectionism, long-term investments sacrificed for quarterly results. The pattern was undeniable and deeply unsettling. Marcus had believed he was making tough but necessary decisions. The evidence suggested something darker: a leader isolated from the consequences of his actions, shielded by layers of management who told him what he wanted to hear while covering up problems until they became too big to hide. "I think we have enough," Ellie said finally after 2 hours of searching. "This proves Reynolds knew exactly what he was doing." "What happens after the board meeting?" Marcus asked, struggling to keep his voice neutral. "If all goes well, Reynolds gets removed. Alex has already identified a potential replacement, someone who understands the company's real value." "Who?" Ellie hesitated. "I can't say yet, but someone who respects what made Pinnacle work in the first place." As they shut down the computers and removed all traces of their presence, Marcus's mind raced. He needed to speak with the board before Monday, get ahead of this situation. But doing so would reveal his deception and possibly validate the employees' concerns. No CEO who truly understood his company should need to go undercover to learn these truths. The Pinnacle family's day picnic on Saturday presented a new challenge. Marcus had planned to make a brief appearance as himself, the CEO, before leaving for other commitments. Now he needed to be there as Mark from it as well. Impossible unless... "I won't be able to make it tomorrow," he told Ellie as they left the building. "Family commitment with my mother." She looked disappointed but nodded understandingly. "No problem, we'll reconvene Sunday night to prepare for Monday." Saturday morning, Marcus arrived at the park where the company picnic was being held. As CEO, he made his scheduled appearance, shaking hands with department heads and posing for photos. The contrast between these carefully choreographed interactions and the raw conversations he'd had as Mark was stark. Executives told him everything was going wonderfully. Mid-level managers smiled tightly and offered no substantive updates. He recognized faces from the IT department who barely concealed their disdain. He spotted Ellie and her group at a distance, watching him with undisguised contempt. The documentary crew filmed it all, capturing both his official tour and the employees' genuine reactions. After 30 minutes, Marcus made his excuses and left, supposedly for another engagement. In reality, he changed clothes in his car, donned his Mark disguise, and returned to the picnic an hour later. The atmosphere was completely different when he wasn't announced as the CEO. People were relaxed, children played, colleagues chatted openly. He moved through the crowd, hearing snippets of conversation, seeing authentic interactions. This was the company culture he'd been missing, the community that existed despite his leadership, not because of it. He spotted Alex in deep conversation with a woman he recognized as the chairperson of Pinnacle's board. They stood apart from the crowd, their body language serious and intent. This was no chance meeting. Marcus maneuvered closer, trying to overhear their conversation without being noticed. "The documentation is compelling," the chairperson was saying, "but are you certain the employees will continue to function if we make this change?" "They're not just functioning now, they're carrying the company despite him," Alex replied. "Imagine what they could accomplish with proper leadership." Marcus felt a chill. The conspiracy reached all the way to the board chair. His position was more precarious than he'd realized. He retreated before they could notice him, mind spinning with possible courses of action. He could confront them now, reveal his identity, and try to take control of the narrative. He could fire the conspirators immediately. He could call an emergency board meeting and present his own version of events. But each option meant admitting he'd been oblivious to major problems within his company. Each meant acknowledging that he'd needed a disguise to hear the truth from his own employees. As Marcus wrestled with these thoughts, he bumped directly into Ellie, spilling her drink. "Mark, you made it," she exclaimed, surprise giving way to pleasure. "I thought you had family obligations." "Change of plans," he managed, helping her clean up the spill. "My mother's treatment was rescheduled." "I'm glad you're here. Come meet some people." She led him to a group that included Raj, Sasha, and several others he recognized from the meetings. They welcomed him warmly, offering food and drinks, including him in their conversations and inside jokes. For the first time in years, Marcus felt part of something rather than above it. The sensation was both unfamiliar and oddly satisfying. As the afternoon progressed, he found himself genuinely enjoying their company. These people he'd been planning to lay off, whose jobs he'd seen as expendable statistics, were suddenly real and dimensional. Raj spoke about his children with pride. Sasha shared her passion for community theater. James discussed the local food bank where he volunteered. They had full lives outside of Pinnacle. They cared about their work and their colleagues, and somehow, despite what they perceived as hostile leadership, they'd maintained their commitment to the company's mission. "To Pinnacle," Raj toasted as the sun began to set, "not what it is, but what it could be again." "To Pinnacle," the group echoed. Marcus raised his cup with them, a lump forming in his throat. For the first time, he saw clearly what his leadership had cost, not just in financial terms or productivity metrics, but in human potential and shared purpose. The revelation shook him to his core. Sunday night's meeting had a different energy, anticipation mixed with anxiety. The group had compiled their evidence, organized by department and impact area. Marcus watched as they professionally presented each case, the documentation meticulous and damning. "We've identified over $40 million in unnecessary costs from Reynolds' decisions," James explained, displaying a spreadsheet. "Not budget cuts, actual waste from abandoned projects, employee turnover, system failures, and contractual penalties. The product roadmap has been altered 12 times in 3 years," added a product manager. "No coherent strategy, just reactive cuts and sudden pivots based on quarterly pressures." "Employee retention is at an all-time low," Sasha reported. "We've lost 64% of senior developers in 2 years. Recruitment costs alone are crippling us, not to mention lost institutional knowledge." One by one, they built their case, a comprehensive indictment of Marcus's leadership, supported by data he couldn't dispute because he'd seen the original documents himself. Finally, Alex stood. "Tomorrow, I present this to the board with a recommendation for immediate leadership change. The bylaws allow for CEO removal with a 2/3 vote, which I believe we have secured." "What about interim leadership?" asked Raj, "who runs the company while a search is conducted." Alex smiled. "That's already arranged. The board has identified a candidate with intimate knowledge of Pinnacle's operations and culture, someone who can begin healing the damage immediately." Who? Several voices asked simultaneously. That will be announced tomorrow, Alex replied, but I believe you'll all be pleased with the choice. The meeting concluded with a sense of nervous anticipation. As people gathered their things, Ellie approached Marcus. Thank you for your help, she said quietly. I know it was a risk. It was the right thing to do, he replied, surprising himself with his sincerity. She smiled. See you tomorrow. He nodded, though he had no idea how he would navigate the coming day's dual identities. That night, alone in his penthouse, Marcus made the most difficult decision of his career. He would not fight this, he would not expose the conspiracy or attempt to preserve his position. The evidence was too compelling, the problems too real, his failures too profound. But he wouldn't simply be removed either. He would take control of his exit on his own terms. He spent hours drafting an email to the board explaining his undercover investigation and what he had learned. He admitted his mistakes, acknowledged the valid concerns of the employees, and proposed a path forward, one that included his voluntary resignation. At dawn, he sent the email with supporting documentation, including journal entries he'd made throughout the week detailing his discoveries. Then he dressed as Mark from IT one final time and headed to the office to face whatever came next. The moment the elevator doors opened on the third floor, Marcus knew something was wrong. The energy was different, tense, expectant. Small groups of employees huddled in conversation, falling silent as he passed. The documentary crew was already set up, cameras positioned strategically throughout the space. He found Ellie at her desk looking pale. What's happening? He asked. She glanced around before answering in a hushed voice. Someone leaked our plan. Reynolds knows. His assistant just called an all-hands meeting for 10 a.m. Marcus's stomach dropped. Had his email to the board been shared already? How did he find out? We don't know, but Alex says to proceed as planned. The board meeting is still happening, just earlier than expected. They're gathering now. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of nervous activity. The conspirators huddled in quick, urgent conversations. The documentary crew filmed everything, their presence now openly acknowledged as part of the plan. Employees from other floors came to the IT department, drawn by rumors of something big happening. At 9:55, Alex arrived, moving purposefully through the growing crowd to find Ellie and the core group. Marcus watched as she spoke to them quickly, her expression unreadable. The group's reactions ranged from shock to confusion to cautious optimism. At precisely 10 a.m., the large screens throughout the office flickered to life. Instead of Marcus Reynolds' face, as everyone expected, the screen showed the boardroom where the chairperson sat flanked by other board members. Attention Pinnacle employees, she began. The board has called this emergency session to address serious concerns about company leadership and direction. The room fell silent, hundreds of employees watching in stunned surprise. Over the past week, we have received substantial documentation regarding management decisions that have damaged Pinnacle's operations, culture, and long-term viability. The board takes these concerns extremely seriously. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Ellie and her group exchanged triumphant glances. This morning, we also received an unprecedented communication from CEO Marcus Reynolds. The murmurs grew louder. Marcus stood very still, heart pounding. In this communication, Mr. Reynolds informed us that he has spent the past week working undercover within the company, directly experiencing the impacts of his leadership decisions and hearing unfiltered feedback from employees. Gasps and exclamations filled the room. Heads turned, people looking around in confusion and disbelief. Mr. Reynolds has acknowledged significant failures in his leadership approach, communication structures, and strategic priorities. He has tendered his resignation, effective immediately. The room erupted. Ellie turned to Marcus, eyes wide with shock, then narrowing with sudden suspicion. Additionally, the chairperson continued when the noise subsided. The board has unanimously voted to accept the recommendation for new leadership, a candidate who has demonstrated exceptional understanding of Pinnacle's core values and operational needs. Alex stepped forward, all eyes turning to her. Employees of Pinnacle, the chairperson announced, please welcome your new CEO, Alexandra Vega, majority shareholder and original founding investor of Pinnacle Technologies. The revelation hit the room like a thunderclap. Alex, the consultant, the board ally, the mastermind behind the evidence gathering, was actually the company's founding investor. Some of you know me as Alex from HR, she addressed the stunned crowd. Others as a consultant. A few of you discovered my connection to the board, but before Marcus Reynolds acquired controlling interest in Pinnacle, I was the principal investor who funded the original founders. Marcus stared in disbelief. He had acquired his shares from a consortium of investors. He'd never known one person had held the majority before him. I retained a significant minority stake and a board seat, Alex continued. I've watched with growing concern as the company culture and product quality were sacrificed for short-term gains. When conventional oversight failed, I decided to take a more direct approach. She gestured to the documentary crew, who were still filming everything. This was never about creating promotional material. It was about documenting the reality of Pinnacle under current management, both the problems and the incredible talent and dedication of its employees despite those problems. The pieces fell into place in Marcus's mind. The entire scenario, the documentary, the conspiracy, perhaps even the rumors of unionization that had prompted his undercover mission, had been orchestrated by Alex to expose the truth from all angles. And finally, Alex said, I believe we have one more revelation to address. All eyes turned to Marcus as Alex approached him. Isn't that right, Mr. Reynolds? The accusation hung in the air of the employee break room, now deadly silent despite being packed with workers. Marcus Reynolds, CEO of Pinnacle Technologies, felt his carefully constructed facade crumbling as Ellie Chen, a mid-level software developer, slapped a folder of printed emails onto the table between them. The documents were unmistakable, internal memos about the planned layoffs, marked with his digital signature, dated 3 weeks before he'd begun his undercover stint as Mark, the new IT support hire. A sea of betrayed faces surrounded him. These were the same people who'd welcomed him, trained him, shared lunches with him, people whose jobs he'd been secretly evaluating for elimination while pretending to be their colleague. I thought you were different, Ellie continued, her voice trembling with quiet rage. You sat right here yesterday and promised we were all safe. You looked me in the eye while knowing my entire department is on the chopping block. Marcus opened his mouth, but no words came. The conference room door slammed open, and the production crew that had been documenting his undercover journey for the corporate video series rushed in. The cameras that had been Marcus's idea, his brilliant PR move to humanize the company during the restructuring, were now capturing his complete undoing. Turn those damn cameras off, he finally managed, his voice hoarse. No, said another voice, James from accounting, standing now. Let them record. Let everyone see exactly who's running this company. The crowd parted as someone new approached. Alexandra Vega walked deliberately toward him, extended her hand, and said the words that would change everything. Hello, Mr. Reynolds. I'm the real owner of Pinnacle Technologies, and I believe it's time we had a chat about your performance review. Marcus slowly removed his glasses and fake stubble, facing the employees directly for the first time. Yes, he acknowledged, I am Marcus Reynolds. The room erupted again, anger, betrayal, confusion. He raised his hands for silence. Everything you've said about my leadership is true. I lost sight of what makes Pinnacle valuable, its people, its mission, its culture. I convinced myself that financial metrics were the only measure of success, and I insulated myself from the real impacts of my decisions. He turned to Ellie, whose expression remained coldly furious. I'm sorry, not just for the deception, but for the damage. You were right about me, but you were also right about Pinnacle, what it was and what it could be again. Pretty words, James called out, but you were still planning to cut 30% of us while pretending to be our colleague. Yes, Marcus admitted, when I started this charade, that was the plan. I won't pretend otherwise or claim some sudden redemption, but I did learn the truth and I did choose to step down rather than fight it. With your generous executive package intact, I'm sure, someone else shouted. No, Alex interjected. Mr. Reynolds has waived all severance and unvested stock options as part of his resignation. That money will instead fund the infrastructure improvements and project reinstatements we've been discussing. This silenced the room more effectively than anything yet. I don't expect forgiveness, Marcus said into the quiet. I don't deserve it. but I hope that by stepping aside voluntarily, I'm at least not adding a protracted leadership battle to the damage I've already caused." He looked around at the faces watching him, some angry, some satisfied, many simply stunned. "Pinnacle deserves better than what I gave it. It deserves the leadership that believes in its original vision. It deserves you," he gestured to the assembled employees, the people who cared enough to fight for it even when that seemed hopeless. Marcus turned to Alex, extending his hand. "The company is yours, as it perhaps always should have been." She took it firmly. "Not mine, ours," she addressed the crowd. "That's the first change I'm implementing as CEO, an employee ownership program giving those who build Pinnacle a direct stake in its success." The announcement sparked a cautious wave of optimism through the room. As Alex outlined her immediate plans, halting the layoffs, revisiting abandoned projects, restructuring the executive team, Marcus watched the faces of the people he'd worked alongside for the past week. Their suspicion gradually gave way to tentative hope. When Alex finished speaking, Marcus stepped forward one last time. "There's nothing I can say to undo what I've done," he said quietly, "but I can tell you what I've learned. Leadership isn't about corner offices or stock prices or even making the tough calls. It's about listening to the people who actually do the work. It's about serving the mission rather than your own ambitions. It's about creating something that matters." He looked directly at Ellie. "You taught me that. All of you did. I'm just sorry it took a disguise for me to hear it." With that, Marcus Reynolds turned and walked out of Pinnacle Technologies for the last time, not as a CEO, but as a humbled man who had briefly glimpsed what real leadership could be. Behind him, under Alexandra Vega's direction, the company he'd nearly destroyed began its journey toward becoming what it was always meant to be, not just profitable but purposeful. Not just successful, but significant. And in the end, that was what truly mattered. If this story resonated with you, hit that subscribe button. There's always more to the story when you look beneath the surface.